Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the next in our series of the Collective Impact webinar series. I am Amelia Pismaive. I'm the Deputy Director at USBC, and I'm very glad to have you all join us for this session. So this bi-monthly series was launched as part of our efforts to engage stakeholders in a collective impact model, which is the third goal of the USBC strategic framework. With funding support from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, this series will focus on building the capacity of the breastfeeding field to apply collective impact principles and tools to collaborative efforts for policy and practice change. Webinars are held every 2 months in even-numbered months on the 4th Tuesday of the month from 2 o'clock to 3:30 p.m. Eastern. The recording, along with any handouts or slides, will be posted in the new Collective Impact Learning Community and on the public webpage linked below. So it's usbreastfeeding.org/collective-impact. A few logistics to get us started. During today's sessions, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. However, we'd love to hear your insights, questions, and comments, so you could submit your questions at any time during the webinar. And here's how you do it. If you go to the control panel on the right of your screen, if you don't see it, it may be minimized. Click on the orange tab and it will pop back out. If you scroll down below the audio section, you'll see a tab for questions. When you click on it, it will open up a box for you to type in. If you have any technical issues during today's session, please send an email to office@usbreastfeeding.org, and our staff will do their best to assist you. And this brings us to today's topic, collaborative governance and adaptive leadership. One of the challenges of collective impact is agreement on governance and decision-making. This session will provide participants with an understanding of the unique governance challenges that multi-sector collaborative change efforts face, including strategies to build trust, navigate the process-product tension, and deal with multiple levels of accountability. Learn about the eco-cycle of collaboration and the approaches that help navigate the dynamic tensions embedded in each of the phases of collective impact, and overcome the traps that get in the way of collaborations moving forward. We will learn how adaptive leadership skills help mobilize people to tackle tough challenges and thrive. We're very pleased to have today's presenter with us. Sylvia Cheuy is a director at Tamarack, an Institute for Community Engagement. She leads the Deepening community online learning team and provides coaching, leadership, and support in the fields of collaborative leadership, collective impact, and community engagement. She is an internationally recognized trainer and community builder and is also an editor of Engage, Tamarack's award-winning e-magazine. Prior to joining Tamarack full-time, Sylvia was the director of Headwaters Communities in Action, a grassroots citizen group that fosters collaborative leadership and action in support of a long-term vision of well-being for Ontario's Headwaters region. Sylvia is a skilled facilitator and has a proven track record in finding and securing grant funding, both project and capital, to support innovative community projects. She recently completed her master's diploma in social innovation at the University of Waterloo, where she explored opportunities to create change within regional food systems. Those of you who have been with us earlier in this series, Sylvia presented the kickoff webinar for this, laying the foundation of collective impact principles. We've now had, I think, 4 webinars since that time, and we're delighted to bring her in to talk about collaborative governance. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sylvia.
Amelia, thanks so much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon. So I'm very happy to walk you through this presentation, and my hope is that the chat box will be alive because I really welcome your comments and questions as we walk on through. So this slide just kind of gives you information on how to get hold of me and reminds you that I welcome comments, questions, and follow-up after today's webinar. If I can be of help, I would love to be. I know you folks have done some work with Liz Weaver, my colleague, and so you're fairly familiar with the work at Tamarack. But here's kind of an overview. I'm really excited to let you know we just launched a brand new website, so are really eager to have you all come and check it out and hopefully find lots of resources to help you in your work. So as Amelia said, I really want to first kind of root this notion of collaborative governance and adaptive leadership within the context of collective impact and specifically the backbone role, right? So, because that's where a lot of the leadership around some of the governance issues anyway often show up. As mentioned, I really want to introduce you to the EcoCycle tool, which some of you may have seen before, but really aligns beautifully, I think, with the 5 phases of collective impact and how it unfolds, and really gives you some practical insights around some of the leadership challenges at different phases in a collective impact effort. Really want to then kind of drill down specifically on this notion of adaptive leadership and begin to distinguish it from more traditional forms of leadership that many of us are probably well familiar with, and have sort of recommended a couple of tools and ideas to really help you take this theory and begin to put it in practice in the forums that you are working in. So here you go, just the grounding again, right? If I take us right down to the bottom, because I really see a lot of the holding of the spirit of a collective impact effort being rooted in the backbone infrastructure. And really, it holds that bird's eye view across the complexity and dynamic nature of a collective impact effort and plays a real facilitative role, convener role, really helping to coordinate and align the work of multiple working groups, and also helps to kind of mine the data and the stories so that people see the momentum, the movement, and the progress of your shared effort around addressing a complex issue. So let's go a little bit deeper into this, because I think it is so foundational to the collaborative governance and adaptive leadership components for sure. I love this analogy from our colleague Jay Connor. He really kind of reminds us that it's useful to think about the role of the backbone folks, backbone leadership, as not unlike the overall project manager on a building site, and coordinating the multiple actions and activities of many different skilled trades and folks to ensure that we're all kind of heading in the same direction. Happy to recognize that since first publishing the original papers in collective impact, we've seen the folks at FSG and other practitioners as well really go deeper on unpacking this critical role of the backbone, identifying those 6 core functions, and really, I think there's an art. So if the 6 kind of roles to the side are the science or the practicality of the backbone role, I think there is also a real art, because you may not have formal or leadership accountability to kind of enforce people to behave a particular way, and so honoring relationships, building trust, building confidence, and also not being afraid to sort of name when we need to get better, I think is an interesting tension and role that has to be held by the backbone. Not surprisingly, we're seeing this a lot, particularly as collective impact is being embraced more widely as an approach of promise. There are lots of folks that are flying fast and loose with what their understanding of the backbone and the backbone role is. So it's useful to see that there's now begun to be some real documentation around that. In particular, the thing that I think I'm seeing the most is lots of folks eager to rebrand the work that they've always done through the lens of collective impact, though not really kind of moving beyond the surface to challenge themselves to think and work differently. And in that kind of a space, then grabbing the role of the backbone as assuming it's the one that will have all the power, authority, and resource. And really, my experience is, in fact, there isn't just one style of backbone. There's several, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But also that so much of this work is leadership by consensus and inspiration as opposed to by formal role, because you're not an organization in a collective impact effort. You're actually a network of different stakeholders aligning and choosing to work together. So as I mentioned, my colleague Liz Weaver has done some really cool work more recently to document that from all the different groups that we've been working with, for sure, we're seeing all kinds of different approaches to backbones. And I think the big takeaway here, like obviously we'll share the slides so you can go deeper on each and every one of them, but I think the big takeaway I want you to hold on to is that there is no one perfect model. So whatever you choose, I think, is dictated in part by the unique context of how your particular collective impact project is unfolding, and that going into it recognizing A, that there are pros, and B, that there are cons with any and all choices, and seeing that there isn't just one way should, I hope, give you some freedom to experiment and tailor and find a backbone structure that works for you and your leadership folks. So let me show you some illustrations of that. So we've also seen, backbones that really kind of align across a continuum around an issue. So this would be around educational achievement, and you'll see, there might be a group that's working on backbone on high school graduation. There might be another whole network of collaboratives working around early years and school readiness. There may be another one on college readiness and access. So, one way a backbone could function is knowing that there are these networks kind of working to align them and have them using the same lens and assessment tools to talk about their work and bring it into some mutually reinforcing activities together. A great example of this is the poverty reduction work done by the Hamilton Roundtable on Poverty Reduction, and you'll see really clearly, when they came to the fore and wanted to do some work around poverty, initially they were having difficulty convening people to come and talk about the issue. But they were able to get incredible traction and response when they looked at their data and recognized that for Hamilton, the overwhelming majority of folks living in poverty happened to be children. So when they framed it through the lens of making their community the best place to raise a child, that actually helped them to see that there were already networks, and you'll see them, right, that were formed and existing in the community long before they came along, that were focused to some degree or other on key moments or milestones on a journey out of poverty. And so a lot of the work that the Roundtable did from a backbone role was really to help ensure that these established collaborative tables had an opportunity and information to view their work through the lens of poverty, and therefore help develop strategies that were sensitive to addressing issues of poverty in how they did their work. And then they did a lot of the monitoring and reporting and championing and celebrating of that work. Here's another kind of frame, right? So this would be a community-focused frame where there may be a host of issues that are at play that a group is working on or identifying, sort of perhaps within an umbrella around community well-being. That would be a perfect example. And so each one of these dimensions plays an important role in contributing to the overall well-being of a community. And so it's sort of geographically or community-focused with a range of issues kind of being linked together. A great example of that is this Memphis Fast Forward, which some of you may already be familiar with. So in some ways, it's a nested backbone. So they have backbones kind of functioning for each of the 5 issue areas or initiative areas that they've kind of identified as being critical to ensuring that Memphis moves forward constructively into the future. And then there is an overarching backbone that coordinates the work across these 5 groups. So there's just another frame and approach. And then there's also a system-focused kind of backbone, and I think this probably aligns most with you all in the work that you're doing, where you have a national or state organization that's sort of serving as an offering backbone support to a number of local, regional, or statewide initiatives and helping to link and coordinate them together and looking for opportunities to perhaps advocate for systems change and policy change at a national level, but building on the lived experience and the learnings that they're gleaning from multiple local efforts. And Vibrant Communities Canada would be another great example, which is the poverty reduction network that Tamarack was instrumental in creating and is still kind of working around. So when they started, the network had 5 players, then it grew to 15, and now today I think we have 50 active members, and each one has made a commitment to bringing multiple sectors together to collaborate on developing poverty reduction strategies for their community. And while their approaches may be wildly different, the design principles that all Vibrant Communities projects aspire to or commit to are, a commitment to ongoing learning and change, a real focus on building of assets, and a real commitment to thinking comprehensively and acting comprehensively to honor that multi-sectoral and diverse nature of poverty. So what we know, certainly at Tamarack, learned in the field from all the work we've done supporting multiple collective impact efforts on poverty reduction through Vibrant Communities, is that it's really useful to think about this work in 3 to 5 year phases or chunks. Because while it is long-term, multi-year work, it's hard to project out, and the world may change so dramatically beyond 5 years that probably thinking in these 5-year chunks is useful. And when we do that, one of the things that we know for sure is that the kind of governance needed and the kind of leadership needed for a collective impact effort will vary and change as the effort matures. So many of you may have seen an earlier version of this, and recently FSG has upgraded the phases of collective impact to include a new 5th one, which is actually phase 1 around assessing readiness. So there's an acknowledgement that there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done to pull different partners together and have multiple conversations before you can actually put a circle around what your common agenda may be and assess whether there's adequate passion, leadership, and readiness to take action. I think for the purposes of our conversation, I just want to get us to focus specifically on this governance and infrastructure. So this is just affirming the earlier slide. Governance and infrastructure is something that needs to be thought about through the entire length of a collective impact effort, but the nature of that work and its focus will shift and change as the initiative gets clearer in terms of its own work and moves from kind of assessment into specific action. And then ultimately, as we move toward the end, it is also about thinking about things like succession planning and renewal, past a 5-year stage, because you're always going to have to kind of refine and adapt your work. And sometimes, and we've seen this as well, you get to the end of a 5-year phase and momentum has dissipated, and it may be time to wrap up the initiative for a period of time and let it go dormant before you can bring it back to life again. So I think I've talked a lot about this already. I think the other piece, this is starting to move us into that eco-cycle model that Amelia referred to at the beginning. So this is a model and a framework that comes from nature. So rather than thinking linearly, sort of like a clock, it's about looking at patterns in nature and seeing how initiatives tend to develop over time. So for those of you who have not seen this before, it starts in the bottom left quadrant where you're in a phase of exploration and you're really starting to think about is there an idea? That kind of aligns with the assessing readiness phase 1. Are there ideas? And there may be multiple different attempts at thinking we might want to address a problem in a host of ways. Over time, of all the seedlings, if you think about a metaphor of the forest, you'll very clearly see that some of the initiatives really get traction and make sense to sort of scale up to maturity, and then others don't really take root, and that's fine. And then as you come up the curve, you kind of move from that birth quadrant to the maturity quadrant, which is the top right. This is a time when, you've put a lot of energy into some very specific initiatives that are showing promise, and they're really kind of gaining momentum. You've let go of some of the earlier trials that have not yet had traction, and so this is a time when you're having to transition out of experimenting and trying gazillions of new things and really putting your energy and effort behind the 3 or 4 that are really showing a lot of promise, and really working to systematize, standardize, and maximize the effectiveness with which you execute on those promising ideas. Then over time, you need to be thinking about how do we bring in new ideas and keep things fresh, and or you may find that some initiatives that are part of your effort have reached their lifespan and they're less effective, less promising, and you need to perhaps choose to let some of these initiatives go and in order to make space to come back up the loop from the bottom right to the top left, and really kind of begin with more experimentation, introducing new ideas, and starting into renewal. What I love about the eco-cycle lens, which we're going to work through again in a bit more depth, is 2 things. One, I think most of us are familiar with what's referred to here as the performance loop. You know, the pathway in which you start with a range of great new ideas, and then you look for how you grow and mature a smaller number of those and to success. I think we are less familiar and less often willing to acknowledge the need for renewal, the need for consciously letting go and wrapping up and ending things in order to create space for the new. And I think that's one of the gifts that the eco-cycle offers us. I think the other thing that's really useful is that as we think of these various phases that most complex initiatives go through over time, there's been some research around some very predictable traps that show up as we try to mature from one phase of the eco-cycle to another. And just having those traps mapped and articulated, I think, can be really useful as a touchstone for your group as your effort matures, to really kind of step back and say, are we falling into this trap? And or to be able to predict what's the next challenge, leadership challenge, that your initiative is going to face and how to work with that. So you'll see here, this is what this is starting to look like. So, you know, you're moving from exploration of possible ideas into the development of a new, to developing a handful of them. You know, the first trap you bump into is often referred to as the scarcity trap, where, you know, you haven't been able to secure the fullness of resources you need to exploit every innovative possible idea that's showing up. And so you're going to have to make some choices around where you want to invest your energy and your leadership. I'm going to actually flip to the next slide because I think it maps it out more fully. So scarcity, that's when you're moving from all your multiple exploration ideas and zeroing in on 2 or 3 initiatives where you're going to start to drill down more deeply. And so what happens here is that you've got too few resources to support all the ideas, and or some of the new ideas lead to outcomes or garner support. Those are 2 of the big kind of challenges of the scarcity trap. And here are some of the challenges that typically show up in that phase. You know, it's about that tension where, for me, this is the place where there's a tension where leaders of a collaborative effort are really feeling eyes on them and people asking, you guys seem to have been talking and thinking for a long time, when are you going to do something? What are you going to do? And so there's an urgency that they're feeling around taking action, and yet at the same time there isn't necessarily right away, obviously, the clarity and the clear direction around certain ideas over others. Say we do zero in and we move and we pick 2 or 3 promising ideas to begin as a starting point for shared action, and some of them are beginning to kind of form and take off and demonstrate progress. The next challenge that shows up is, you know, when you're moving from that developmental experiment stage into maturity. And the trap that shows up here is often referred to as the charisma trap. And in this, there are often some primary funders or primary leaders who've been instrumental in launching the effort, and they get to a place where they recognize that this collaborative effort is perhaps outshining their own organization or getting more traction, more attention, and it's actually kind of becoming more of a parasite on the initial host. So what shows up in this phase is we may be reliant on one or two key leaders who may need to move on. It shows up in terms of having some startup resources, but we're having trouble attracting enough adequate funding to grow some of the ideas we've landed on to maturity. And it may be a time when our fiscal host is ready to put us out of the nest, and we may be needing to find a new home for the initiative. And those are some of the common challenges. I remember when I was leading the collaborative effort I led, one of the challenges for us was 2 or 3 years in, our host saying, okay, you've gotten traction, you've moved out, and now you need to kind of figure out either what to do next and whether you need to stand on your own. And we weren't fully expecting that, and they were completely patient, but it was difficult because we had had our eyes so focused on launching our initial initiatives and getting them up and running well, we hadn't really thought we would have to be looking at shifting our structure at the same time. But we successfully navigated it and explored a whole host of options as a result, but it wasn't an easy thing for sure. Okay, so say you have now some mature initiatives and you're recognizing that some of them are proving to be more effective or less effective than they once were, and it might be time to kind of step back and rethink approaches. What some of the challenges are here is that, people are feeling like we've got a good thing. Why do we have to give it up? Why do we have to add new things? And it's the pressure when things are going well to also kind of embrace and include enough space for change and innovation to continually be evolving within your effort. And then the final phase is, when you've kind of moved and you've let go of some things and you're in a place of renewal or re-exploration. I think, some of the challenges that we see is that there are some people who still think we shouldn't have given up on some of the ideas that we've given up on. Some people are tired. We need to bring in new perspectives, new ideas, and there's a tension and a danger around bringing us back to our core and helping us to figure out where we might want to go next. So not that all of these will always show up for you in a collaborative effort, but I do think they're useful to think about because they do have implications for leadership. And they do have implications around the evolution of your collaborative governance framework. Overall, what on the next slide I'm showing you is a way to take this idea of the eco-cycle and develop it as a bit of a tool. So routinely, one of the things that we will do is, after explaining the core kind of quadrants of the eco-cycle, invite people to use dots to talk about where they see their initiative at currently. And this is a useful tool then, a dialogue tool, because obviously if some people see your initiative very much in the exploration phase, but others see it in development, that might be a sign that there are gaps in knowledge between different levels of your effort that need to be closed. It may be reflective of the fact that you have some new folks coming on board and you haven't given enough thought to how you onboard people and catch them up to the work. And then ultimately, because the traps are kind of laid out and made more transparent, it does then invite conversation as a whole group or a group of leaders to talk about, okay, so what is it that we need to be mindful of as we think about the next step in our evolution and make sure that we're anticipating that over time. So, and this is these are often the reflective questions that we give to folks as they, after they've put the dots on the map. What does this mean for you right now in your work? What do you need to think about in terms of communicating with key stakeholders? And what are some strategies that you can identify for your group in terms of effectively navigating what we know the traps to be? So that's kind of a way of framing the collaborative or the eco-cycle, the phased evolution of a collaborative initiative. and a collective impact effort, the kinds of different leaderships that are needed. Obviously in the exploration phase, having a retired entrepreneur is probably the best kind of leader because they've got lots of time to offer you and they're very comfortable in that space of kind of generating new ideas, experimenting and trying things out. But then as you're moving toward maturity, that kind of a leader might be more of a detriment at a time when you need to consolidate and not keep introducing new ideas, but really put your energy and practice behind a few really promising ideas to grow to traction. And so then at that phase, the kind of leadership that's really required are folks that are really good at systematizing and documenting and structuring promising ideas into consistent practice, right? So it's just a useful way to think about where is your leadership. Also, it would be a lovely way to open up a conversation around your table, around, as leaders, collectively in an effort, where do you individually feel most comfortable? What's the space you enjoy the most? Because knowing that we have those different interests and talents helps us then to know, not only when the time comes for us to move forward to a next phase, who is a natural leader who can maybe hold the space and pull us towards where we need to be. So that kind of introduces the phase nature of the work. Now I want to go a little bit deeper on what we know about collaborative governance. So ultimately, what the governance role is about is making the working relationships between the partners both visible and highly functioning, documenting but not over-documenting, and I think that's the tension, the practices and the structures needed to help facilitate this work happening. I think that the governance pieces for a collaborative effort need to focus both on the process and the product of governance in a collaborative, and I think it requires us all as leaders to be deliberate and intentional. So for me, I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen lately is that most of us spend so much of our professional lives working in formal organizations that unconsciously and by default, we can fall into old patterns of behaving as though our collective impact effort is an organization when in fact it isn't. And I think it's useful to remember and to remind ourselves when we start falling into those patterns, because there are ways in which the models and frameworks we bring from traditional organizations are useful and helpful to us, but there are other ways in which they actually get us stuck and have us falling back into ways that are counter to the intent and impact of a collective impact effort. So I think, some of the challenges that we see when we're working at a governance framework that is intentionally collaborative is issues of membership and membership contribution. So, recently, and I love this notion, it doesn't matter, we recognize that different players from different sectors and different perspectives are needed at the leadership level in our collective impact effort. And then given that diversity, we have to know and anticipate that what each member can contribute is going to look quite different one to the other. But how do we make sure that I think everyone contributes, because that's how you demonstrate your commitment to the work, but recognize that each contribution may not be the same, but is equal in its reflection of that partner's investment in the work. I think one of the other challenges that we often run into with membership is different members having different levels of knowledge both within their organizations and around the table itself, around what the problem is and what needs to happen to make that happen. It takes time and energy to build the relationships, trust, and understanding to view a problem that we've confronted in our individual work differently, honoring the richness of the multiple perspectives. And I think, when I think about this third point around member organizations not being engaged, for me, I think there's a real tension always between creating relationships with individuals who are representative of organizations, and how do we ensure that we are not only continuing to engage that individual, but supporting that individual in engaging and keeping their entire organization engaged and invested in the collaborative work as well. Decision making is the other big one that we see a lot of where some of the challenges show up. Unclear decision making or not consistently applying the agreements around decision making, and lack of clarity around who can make what decisions at what level. I think I would add a fourth one to this, and that is, holding the tension between being inclusive and welcoming and always inviting in new voices and perspectives, and yet being clear around who has the authority to vote, and ensuring that we don't end up having to come back and retry decisions that have already been made because we're adding new people on. And that's a hard tension to hold, for sure. And lastly, collaborative governance runs into trouble when we haven't written anything down and nobody's clear and there are no policies or frameworks to guide us. And, decision-making authorities are not clear. I would also say another place that is difficult is when we move too quickly in that vacuum where we're trying to zero in on what we think the problem is, but we haven't quite nailed it, and we're feeling all kinds of pressure from the community around explaining what we're doing and why. There is a temptation in that vacuum to then leap to, well, we need to incorporate, or we need to create a governance structure, and making it so rigid that by the time we finish iterating and landing on what we know it to be and feeling really strongly about that, we have unintentionally created a governance structure that is too narrow to fit the work as it ultimately ends up being. So, what are the pieces? For sure, what we've learned is not only do we need a common agenda, but we actually need a positive aspiration that the community as a whole can get excited about and get behind and be willing to invest in. Because so much of the work of a collective impact effort is relational, having guiding principles not only about how we're going to work, but how we work together, I think is critical. And documenting, making visible so that it becomes easy to test whether we're all thinking about the same thing, even if we're using the same words, do we mean the same thing? And also as a way to quickly bring new members up to speed on the work is creating and documenting visually our framework for change, which is different than a logic model. Because a logic model presumes we already know. A framework for change is saying this is our working assumption around what we think that it is and what we need to do to change it. And implicit in a framework for change is that at a leadership level and throughout a collective impact effort, periodically we're coming back and challenging our framework and our understanding of our issue and how change is going to happen around it. Very practically, once we've got those aspirational pieces kind of nailed, we need to also honor the very tangible, practical, okay, so how are we going to get it done? So this is where memorandums of understanding, committee terms of reference, and mechanisms for mitigating conflict being written and documented, shared and understood, and widely available become really important. And I think, in the spirit of not, you can err on the side of not enough governance. You can also err on the side of too much governance. I think, there are 4 areas that we see as being really critical to have mapped out fairly well. One is membership and decision making. The second is always funding and how is that going to be held and managed. Communicating and reporting, both expectations, whose role, how does it happen, how frequently, in what forms, and then ultimately the policies and procedures that the initiative is going to abide by. So I like this framework. This comes from the Center for Social Innovation in Toronto. And what I like about their collaborative governance model is I think it creates a really nice kind of balance between the emergent nature of collective impact work and the need for clear structure. So on the far left, what we're assuming is that the backbone organization is actually made up of sort of the Collective Impact Initiative Steering Committee and of a core of staff. Pretty small, typically, 1, 2 people, depends on the maturity of the effort. And it's together the steering committee and the backbone staff who are really providing leadership to the collective impact effort. And then what you'll see is that As work evolves or emerges and there's clarity and energy, frankly, to take action together, working groups are formed that can engage different players from across the community, but almost certainly have chairs that have a place and a link back to the steering committee itself. And that there's always an assumption that these efforts coexist within a multitude of different initiatives and partners in a community, number one. And number two, when a working group's work is done, it's done. That group can collapse and be let go, and that creates space for new working groups and new ideas to be formed around. So we talked about earlier, there are those really technical elements. So here are the important issue areas, I think, that need to be touched on in memorandums of understanding between some of the core partners of a collective impact effort. In our experience, when you're developing terms of reference, either for the steering committee of a collective impact effort or even particular working groups, these are, from our experience, some of the core elements that you'd want to be touching on. Okay, so that is kind of like an overview of some of the technical elements of the governance. Key takeaways: you want sufficient governance so people feel supported and clear about how they need to act, how decisions get made, but at the same time you want to find the right balance where you're not over-prescribing and investing tons of energy into creating an administrative monster that you need to keep feeding. So what's the optimum level that gives both the flexibility and freedom but also the clarity? So the final kind of piece that I wanted to really animate in a bit more depth for you is this notion of adaptive leadership. So really at the core, the assumption is that the kind of leadership needed for a successful collective impact effort looks different from the traditional leadership that many of us are familiar with from a organizational context. So first and foremost, and this work comes from Ron Heifetz and his colleagues, who've done a lot of work on this notion of adaptive leadership. And it aligns so beautifully, I think, with the notion of collective impact, where the role and task of an adaptive leader is to mobilize people to work together on tough issues. And I love the second line because I think it really kind of speaks to that point that I was mentioning earlier about a fundamental difference from traditional organizational leadership, that it is not a job that's based on authority, but rather it's a practice that needs to be done and can be done by anyone in the organization or anyone in a collaborative effort. So from the documentation and look at this unique form of leadership, there are some things that we know. So some of the principles that are critical to effective adaptive leadership are a capacity to make change, really a shared understanding of the various leadership competencies that are needed to support the effort. And I would take it concretely one step further to say, around your leadership table right now, who is most comfortable in the various competencies, so we can explicitly know who and how to draw the best leadership possible from our collaborative effort as it unfolds. This notion of taking smart risk, I think implicitly in a collective impact effort, and I was mentioning this to someone the other day, I think I was giving a talk and hearing about a really exciting initiative in Calgary. And they had been working as a collective impact initiative for quite some time and had developed strong partnerships, strong shared data platforms and whatever, and were at a phase in their development where they were welcoming a new ED who very proudly declared that they were fairly confident within 5 years they would eliminate homelessness in the city of Calgary. So that was fantastic. It was aspirational. It was exciting. And because of that bold statement, the initiative was tremendously successful in attracting big funding commitments from multiple players, federal, provincial, municipal, corporate, and philanthropic dollars, all kind of getting behind this aspirational vision. Fairly fairly not long after sort of those commitments were gleaned, the funders pulled the new ED into a meeting and expressed their concern, their worry, right? Because they were now being held accountable by their stakeholders and shareholders that this investment that they'd made in the work of the foundation would actually be successful. And so they were very clear. They wanted certainty from the ED that the bold aspiration of eliminating poverty would be something that would be met. And she paused for a few moments and then stepped back and said, listen, if you want certainty, then I suggest we go back to doing things the way we always have, because then you and I will both be certain it won't work. She then went on to remind them that the sector, the homeless, the folks working in the realm of homelessness were a group of very deeply committed, very intelligent, very driven people. And she said, don't you think if we knew how to fix this problem, we wouldn't have already done it? And that, in that statement, she was able to help remind her funders that this work, this collective impact work, we're stepping into the realm of uncertainty. We know the way we've always done things isn't enough and isn't going to get us to where we want to be, but there is no guarantee that means we necessarily know what needs to happen instead. And so much of the work of a collective impact effort is really about what I would call safe fail experiments. We have to be willing to pilot new ideas, to experiment and work differently. Is everything that we try going to work? Probably not. But I think, with the benefit of shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, we can begin to see and experiment safely with new ideas and know fairly quickly if the initiatives that we're trying to launch are working or not. And so this notion of taking smart risks, for me, really aligns with that. We do have to be willing to try new things. That's the whole point. We know we've got to try something new because we're not getting to where we need to get to right now. And also, I think that the final kind of principle that becomes critical is a willingness to also let go of stuff when it's not working and continue to be willing to move forward. So here's some leadership principles, like how do we put this into action? 10 really concrete practices, I think, that really support this work. The youth framing as a tool for me is really about how do we make visible our current assumptions about how things work and what needs to change. How do we, build a good enough vision? It's not just the vision, it's how do we kind of move forward, get enough alignment, and not feel it has to be perfect, but keep things moving forward. How do we look for opportunities to link and chunk things together to create a cascade of effect and impact? How do we kind of manage the relational dimensions of the work? And how do we acknowledge and celebrate the multiple contributions that folks bring to the table? All of those critically important, I think. I love these as well. So success factors that folks have found to kind of bring adaptive leadership to life. One is recognizing that, you need to be able to move beyond trusting the expertise and content and really have a skill for looking at how to keep things moving forward, how to bring new relationships together, how to leverage off diversity and harness it well. Really viewing yourself not as the doer and the one responsible for getting it all done, but really your job is to be a convener, a host, to bring together the multiple perspectives and help them to see and define together perhaps a new way of working that can benefit them all. And also, this notion of authority, you need to have credibility, I think, and the trust. You need to have enough respect that you can, open doors and be heard and understood by right people. But then, it isn't necessarily about being in the formal leadership position that is the best person to really bring forward the leadership needed for a collaborative effort. So some really key kind of lessons around this work is iterative work. It is those safe fail experiments. So one of the things you need to go into knowing is that unlike other work where you have a clear strategic plan and objectives that you're working towards, you need to plan to replan. This is, we're going to try things. We're going to think our objective is this. We're going to go out there. It's not going to be rooted. People aren't going to gather around it. We're going to have to step back and think about how do we reframe what we're trying to do. That example of Hamilton, knowing their work was about poverty, trying to mobilize people to have a conversation, not getting a lot of traction, having to step back and reframe the work in terms of the aspiration of the children of the community. That was a perfect example of that. What we know about systems change is that it often occurs when there are different levels of the system collaborating and working well and inspiring each other. And so you have to be able to look beyond the present and look at multiple levels at what's happening and seeing innovative opportunities to connect some of these innovations together. And you need to be looking for those places of surprise where things start to bubble where you would least expect it, and know and trust that you need to kind of maybe adapt and move towards where that energy is to keep your initiative overall moving forward positively. All right, so one of the things that often shows up when we're talking about leadership is this notion of power. And it's really important to recognize that there are both formal and informal types of power. And I would say typically a collective impact effort really kind of leverages much more the informal power as much as the formal power brought to this work by the different organizations and leaders that are convened. And I think from the work that we've seen around translating this opportunity into action on the ground in a community and around a particular issue, there are some real dynamics, I think, and we know that there are places where folks stumble. Certainly in that conceptualization stage where there's multiple ideas kind of floating around the table, how do we kind of transition folks to kind of explore all the issues, but then move to a place of convergence? Language can be huge. I was laughing with someone that we were planning a local food summit. Well into the planning, I'm very clear. All along, I've been talking about local food, and to me, it's obvious that's anywhere within 100 kilometers of where I live. My colleague from Maple Leaf Foods, he was equally clear and enthusiastic and excited about local food. And it wasn't until 2 weeks before our big event that I realized to him local food meant anywhere in Canada. So here we are, two native English speakers, never thought to really think about what do we mean when we are using the same words, and we were actually meaning completely different things. One of the other things that isn't here, but I also see increasingly in the realm of collective impact as an area of tremendous focus and attention, is this notion of equity. And recognizing that not all voices necessarily or historically will come to the table with the same perceived power, and that real effort needs to be made to create safe spaces to understand and acknowledge how the lens of equity can affect and change how we unfold the work in our collaborative agreements or in our collective impact efforts. So I think this is just another really good way of translating this notion of adaptive or collaborative leadership and distinguishing it from the more formal forms of leadership that we're more familiar with. So to me, just generally speaking, it would seem that collaborative or adaptive leadership is much more around convening, opening, kind of creating consensus, as opposed to muscling on through. We have, and I will certainly share after this workshop, come upon some fabulous resources created by our Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that they have made freely available that enable people to assess their collaborative leadership capacity around these 6 core areas, which they determine as the core skills of collaborative leadership. And what we found is that even giving folks an opportunity, if they don't fill out the entire questionnaire individually, but just scan through it, people will get a very good sense of where they are strong and where their leadership can contribute well to a collective impact effort, and where their leadership capacity may not be as well established, and therefore they may need to kind of pay attention to and learn from those who are stronger in that particular dimension of leadership. We've also used these assessments to actually invite a leadership group of a collaborative effort to step back and assess, do they have across their entire leadership team the wholeness of leadership skill, and who has what skill. Again, it's a mapping piece. So there you go. Those are my sort of theoretical and also practical kind of overviews of 3 kind of nested ideas and how they fit together. And that kind of brings the formal piece of the presentation that I have brought here to a close. And I really wanted to make sure that I've left ample time to either go deeper on certain elements or have you bring forward your own comments and questions so we can have a bit more of a dialogue. But before going there, I just want to sort of highlight for you, we've got lots of these tools and resources, as I said, and you can find them all freely available there, as well as lots of regular free webinars you can be part of. And just also want to highlight for you our annual, our Community Change Institute will be held in Toronto this year, and we're excited. We've got some really cool keynotes and some really innovative practices and ideas to share. So if you're looking for a cool learning opportunity, I'd love to see a gang of you come on out. So let's go back. Comments, questions, feedback. I'm really open to hearing anything from folks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Sylvia. This is Amelia, and I can queue up a couple of the questions that we've received in the chat box, and I encourage you all to continue to let us know if you have questions that are emerging as you're thinking about all of this great content. So I think a good one to start with is a comment. This is interesting and a little overwhelming. As a coalition just dipping our toe into collective impact, what is the most important thing for us to think about as we consider collaborative governance, and how should we begin?
I think as at a starting point, for me, this work is relational work. So I would say as you're starting, the 2 most important things that you need to talk about are kind of how is it that you as a diverse group of players want to be with one another, what's important around how you surface conflict or difference. It's creating that safe container where diverse perspectives can be put on the table and met with curiosity and not judgment. That would be number 1. I think number 2 would be really inviting each member of your forming collaborative to speak both from the head and the heart about what brings you to this work, and being explicit about not only what you hope to gain from working in this collaborative together, but also what are you willing and able to contribute. So, and if you have accountabilities from an organization that you must report to, being as transparent as each and every one of you can about, here are the boundaries, that I come to this collaborative effort with. So here are the things I can bring. Here are the things that I need. I need to be able to deliver to my organization X, Y, and Z. And personally, I need to see this, this, and this to continue to be invested. That would be one. And the story about what brings you to the work. And because oftentimes, it's those heart connections, understanding people's personal motivations and connection to the issue that can be just as inspiring and helpful in building kind of that team sense of trust. Those would be, from a collaborative governance point of view, I think those would be the big pieces to start with. And then, as you start to operationalize either getting funds or beginning to take action, I think that's when those things like working group terms of reference or memorandums of understanding become critical. If in some cases a newly formed collaborative is nested within an existing organization, if that existing organization happens to be your fiscal host or is holding the dollars for your effort, the other question becomes, are we clear about how that money gets monitored and utilized? And just making sure you have enough handrails for clarity, but not overwhelming yourself, thinking you have to have all of these pieces in place all at once. Does that help?
Yes, I think that's a very thoughtful answer. Thank you. And building off of that, can you say a little bit more about strategies from your experience in infusing equity into each phase of the work, particularly considering that in the beginning we may have typical or long-term partners that aren't very diverse that we're starting with?
I think it's so, one of the tensions or challenges is that it's so cultural, right? It's so, sometimes we're even blind. With the best of intentions, we don't even see if it hasn't been our lived experience. And so I think going in with that kind of awareness and openness is a good starting place. If you are working in a realm or with an organization that historically doesn't have a lot of diversity to draw upon, then I would, intentionally see how you can put a hand out to organizations that do have trust and credibility in working with other populations that you're hoping to draw into your work. And, being candid and asking off, maybe not publicly, but, really kind of expressing your willingness and desire and commitment and getting their active support and ultimately, if they're interested, involvement in your effort. I think that's number one. One of the other things, I think a great example that comes to mind for me, again drawing on the work of the Hamilton Roundtable, many of our poverty reduction roundtables, the issue for us becomes much more about how do we ensure that folks with the lived experience of poverty are active and equal voices at the table in these collaborative poverty reduction efforts. And I think one of the things that can happen, and there was a really powerful learning around this from the folks in Hamilton, is they absolutely had that commitment at every level of their collaborative effort, be it the steering committee level or at the working group levels. They had made a bold commitment to ensure that at least 25% of the folks sitting in the leadership role at any level of their initiative were folks with the lived experience of poverty, because they brought a practicality and a reality to the issue that was really critical and essential. But in spite of the best efforts, they were successful sometimes in recruiting one or two folks in poverty to come and sit at various tables. And inevitably, these folks would come, they'd sit in one or two meetings, and then they'd disappear. And, this was kind of bothersome. So they sat down and brainstormed and, came up with some of the obvious things around, what are the barriers to getting someone with poverty to come to one of these meetings? Well, transportation would be one, childcare might be another, healthy food could be another. So they really kind of were deliberate and intentional about things like free transportation to any and all meetings, honorariums, childcare made available, all kinds of stuff. And again, out they go. They attract folks with poverty, and maybe they stay now for 3 or 4 meetings. But again, they're not staying long term. And so in an effort to really kind of understand what was at the root and how to address it, they began to have some frank conversations with the folks that they had engaged who were living in poverty, and said, we are committed to doing this, and we're doing something wrong because it's just not working. Can you help us understand this better? And one of the big ahas that came up was a woman who spoke up, and she said, listen, every single one of you comes to this meeting as a representative of your organization. So you come with the benefit of a strat plan and a long organizational history and a whole team of folks behind you, so that if at our collaborative table you don't have the answer on behalf of your organization or your sector, you easily get to go back and ask someone for the answer and bring it forward. And she said, we, individuals that you are attracting to this table who happen to be living in poverty, don't have the benefit of that. And so what happens is I, as a single mom with 3 kids living in poverty, know that my experience of poverty is fundamentally different from my neighbor down the hall, who is a disabled senior who's been out of work for the last 4 years. And so she said, I see the eagerness with which each one of you is hanging on my word, but I feel really uncomfortable because I know I am one perspective of poverty, and I feel really uncomfortable speaking for all poor people in this community because, you know what? I can't do that, and it's dishonoring. And so I feel really uncomfortable, and I'd rather not do that. That was huge. So, recognizing that and knowing that from the outset, what they really had to do was step back and say, okay, so what is the constituency then, if not an organization for these folks with the lived experience of poverty? And they began hosting a weekly coffee chat where anyone in the community experiencing poverty could come on out, hang out, and tell their stories to each other. Over time, 2 things happened. One, they started to see who the natural leaders were in that group, who then could be tapped to play leadership roles at the round table at multiple levels. But they also then were much more able to retain those folks because those folks then had a constituency. They knew enough of the stories to see what was the constant, what were the patterns and themes that were consistent regardless of the individual experiences of poverty that were really critical and important to talk about. And then the people who were playing those leadership roles had the confidence of knowing that they too had a constituency that they could go back and check in with if they themselves individually, personally weren't clear. So, I don't presume to that the experience of equity is the same, but I think being clear about the intention to include, being aware that each one of us may come with some preconceived ideas and be willing to have those challenged would be a second. And then the third would be, sometimes we need to do a couple of preparatory pieces, or, we need to do some additional groundwork. It's before we can extend a hand to invite. If we want to, help create that sense of safety for the folks that we're bringing
in. That's lovely, very rich. Thank you, Sylvia. And, I think that really beautifully addressed one of the questions we received that started with a comment. Authentic community engagement is a challenge in many of our efforts. Any insights from your deepening community work that could help us better engage and involve communities of equal stakeholders? And I think you gave us a really lovely illustration of that. And
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I couldn't hear the last little bit.
Oh, okay. So, yes, insights about how to better engage and involve communities as equal stakeholders.
Oh, I think I would add to that particular story a couple of big things. One is, we continue at Tamarack to be inspired by the incredible work of John McKnight. And a recent quote that someone shared with me was, asset-based community development, which John McKnight is the founder of, is the relentless focus on the full half of the glass. So what, his work kind of reminds us is that even in the most destitute areas, there are things that are working. And before we go in and assess need, part of what we need to do is be really intentional about identifying what the needs, assets, skills, and abilities are within the community, helping the community to see those, and then bring those forward authentically into the shared work. And so, really, remember at the beginning I talked about the importance of contribution. People's contributions may look different, but the way you move from someone buying into your idea versus someone co-owning your idea with you, in part emerges from their ability to contribute their gifts, their talents, their knowledge, their skills. And so I think one of the things that we've found really powerful in our community-based citizen engagement work is that oftentimes in today's society, we don't have the time and opportunity to really know and appreciate what are the various gifts that people hold in our neighborhoods and what are the things that they're hungry to learn. And so we can have natural exchange, right? And that over time is what builds trust and builds relationship. And I think sometimes the collective impact efforts are not dissimilar. So we need to really kind of help people to see what the various individual gifts, talents, and skills are that they bring, and provide them with opportunities to contribute those in a variety of ways. That's what keeps people engaged. And that's what helps transition, from my perspective, a collective impact effort being something I've bought into versus something that I feel like I have ownership in. And that's ultimately, for me, where you want to be driving that to. And I think, and this isn't an answer, but more kind of naming attention that I think comes into play when we are really committed to engaging at the local citizen level as well as at the organizational level, is that networks of ordinary people, citizens, don't necessarily neatly follow a project timeline. They have a more organic kind of way of being and way of getting things done. And I think that the tension in engaging citizens in a collective impact effort is, how do we create space where we're not expecting our citizens to behave like they're part of an organization, and not expecting our organizations to be free-flowing and more organic, like a network of neighbors, but to recognize together that they are different. And the question that we all have to wrestle with together is, how do we get better at enabling these two pieces to dance well together and leverage each other's strengths and be aware of each other's strengths, and not fall into a trap of assuming that we all have to be the same or that we all will be.
Very nice. Well, and that's a very nice pivot to our next question, which is, do you have any suggestions for how to get organizational members invested? We have people from organizations who are invested, but their organizations often are not, and or are competitive. So how do we court those partners?
I think that is a really wise and astute observation, because I think you're right. I think ultimately you actually need both. You need the organizational resources and commitment as much as you need those individual passionate people as representatives from the organizations. And I've been on the wrong side of that, right, where I've very successfully drawn in an individual leader of an organization, but haven't pushed hard enough to pull the whole organization in. And then that leader retired and moved out of the community, and it was kind of back to square one, right? So I've lived it. It doesn't feel very good. I think for me, I think it really is about asking your leaders around the table around what are the best ways to engage their individual organizations. Because I think, you know and trust that they may know their organizations best. That might be one way. Another way is, saying to each one of the individual passionate folks that you've attracted from various organizations, if you had to pick 5 or 10 people from within your organization who you would love to have their commitment in this ongoing effort, who would those 10 people be? And then, have, in groups of 20 or 30 or 40, kind of doing a dog and pony show, right? Where those folks show up in the room, not because you, the collaborative, have invited them, but because they like and trust so-and-so and are coming at that person's request. and seeing, so you're continually looking for ways to extend those personal networks within the organization and leverage those to attract more people to the effort. And then I think it's also like looking for those formal places in agendas, in meetings, where that you can bring that story forward. And then sometimes you cannot be a prophet in your own land. You in an organization, sometimes you need to bring some of the heavy hitters from your collaborative table who aren't you as guests into the organization to create a different kind of listening within the organization and or a way of seeing the work differently and perhaps taking it more seriously. But I would really, before going into something like that, I would really want to also take time to think of what are the 1, 2, 3 concrete, assuming that you've done a pitch about the work, what are the 1 or 2 kind of core asks that you want to make of the organization once you've gotten in there. Okay. And or being clear about the ways in which, if they are continuing to be interested, you would love to see their continued involvement or engagement.
Very nice. Very nice. So we have 2 more questions. Have slightly different aspects, but a similar thread. So I'm going to ask them together. Okay. The first is, where would you recommend for us to start first to work on a collaborative project with a common measure, because that feels overwhelming? And then the other question is, while it's relatively easier to measure collective impact program impact, how do we measure partnership effectiveness?
Okay, so measuring partnership effectiveness was the second question. And the first question was, if you can repeat it?
Just how to get started having a collaborative project with a common measure. So I think that's a good order. Like, first, how do you know when you have good partnership effectiveness, and then how do you get going on having a project with a common measure?
I know and can follow up with, there are some self-assessment tools around the strength of your and effectiveness of your collaborative. So in terms of measuring that, the collaboration itself, I know of collective impact efforts who have found or taken and adapted some of those collaboration effectiveness assessments, and they have committed to asking everyone involved in the collaborative to respond to that assessment tool annually and tracking the results. So there's a very concrete and tangible way you can do that. Looking at the collaborative leadership self-assessment tools might also be another dimension of how you kind of measure progress and effectiveness, particularly on the leadership dimension anyway, around a collaborative. Thirdly, it's been a while since I've looked at it, but I know that the FSG folks have published a 3-part guide on evaluating collective impact. And I know that part of it is recognizing that in the early stages, you're looking and evaluating different things than you are as your collective impact initiative matures. And the third of their 3-part guide actually has sample indicators. So I would be really curious to kind of take a look there and see, what for them are the good indicators of leadership and or, collaboration. So that would be, those are kind of three places to start. And then in terms of how do we zero in on a collaborative project with a common measure, I think first and foremost it comes back to that aspirational vision. Because I think that this work is tough work, and oftentimes it's the thing that holds us together is our passion, interest, and commitment to the issue. It touches not just our heads, but our hearts. It's not just something I have to do as part of my work, but it's something I care very, very deeply about. And I just recently had the opportunity to hear someone interview Marion Thompson and kind of document the evolution of La Leche League, right? There is an example of a movement really built out of passion. And so for me, I would always want to start with the broader passion. What do people really care about? What gets them excited? And where is the energy? Like even within, like in the collaborative project that I started around community well-being, we got lots of affirmation for the aspirational vision for the future of our community. We consistently heard that there were 6 concrete projects that people kept saying over and over again were, boy, if we could get any one of these projects done, that would be a move towards from where we are toward the vision. So the fact that we kept hearing the same 6 was interesting and affirming. And then the other piece that was interesting is each one of the 6, multiple organizations in the community had a stake in these 6, but there was no organization in the community that clearly had leadership around this as part of its mission and mandate. So I often find like a collaborative effort is easiest to get started when you are addressing a shared need across multiple players and you're filling a void, as opposed to the risk of stepping on someone else's toes. I think that can be really important to build trust and momentum at the beginning. And so when we came and then revealed our plan and what the results of our consultation had shown, both in terms of affirmation around the vision, the 6 projects that folks kept naming over and over and over again, and did a big ta-da with, about 100 people who had participated in the earlier stages of that process somewhere along the line, we got 3 really important pieces of feedback from the community. The first was, wow, we like all these 6 ideas. Yeah, we think you've nailed it. These are good. That was really important to hear. The second piece that we heard from them was, don't try and do all 6 at once. Acknowledging you are a fledgling entity and somewhat an experimental entity working in this collaborative way, which some of us are somewhat suspicious of. And so you need to recognize that part of your work is about building credibility for yourselves as an entity and credibility for working in this new way. So don't overwhelm yourselves. Pick one thing, pick 2. Don't try to do all 6 of these projects at once, and really drill down and get busy. That was the second piece of advice, and I thought that was really useful and helpful, acknowledging that we were both kind of pioneering a new way of working as well as actually doing the work. And I think that's true of most collective impact efforts, in fact. And then the third piece of advice that they gave that I think was incredible learning for me was, surprise, surprise, there were lofty, lofty projects that were way juicier in my mind than ultimately. But they said, listen, and if we had to tell you which were the places we'd like to start, the number one that they picked was let's connect our existing trails throughout the region into a comprehensive network and system of trails. Wow. In the whole realm of community well-being, where, affordable housing was on the table and all these other things were on the table, I was a bit gobsmacked that trails was the first thing people picked. But the big learning I had was learning to trust energy, learning to trust passion, because what was interesting was in that moment, when that was put on the table, a number of key community leaders, not some of whom I would never have expected, said, wow, if that's the first one, count me in. And then we happened to have a funder there who said, wow, we just released, a new grant stream around health promotion that I think that this work could fit very neatly within. So it was a reminder to me that you got to kind of watch what's getting people excited and where are you getting some momentum, where people want to roll up their sleeves and work. And it may not be what you pick. So you may need to have to let go of what you think it is and go with and trust that energy. Because ultimately, yeah, we did start on trails and it ended up being a blessing because it was so concrete and so real. And some of the other ideas that were on the list were more ephemeral. And we were able to get some real solid success by focusing only on that one project initially. but the way we learned to work and the database of contacts we built through doing that work and the credibility that we gleaned through the successes we were able to manifest in that work really did a lot to solidify the collaborative as a whole, and then ultimately served us well when we leapt into the next project, which was creating a community well-being report for the region. Does that help?
Wonderful. Yes, that's all. Very helpful. Thank you so much. All right. So, really thank you very much for your time today, Sylvia. It was a very powerful presentation. I think gave us all a lot of insight. And we also hope that today's session will generate networking and sharing amongst all of you and those who listen to this recording on the archive. You are invited to join the learning communities that are hosted on the USBC website. We house over 20 virtual communities that focus on breastfeeding-related topic areas from the Surgeon General's call to action and beyond. And these are open to any site user, so please visit and join those that are of greatest interest to you. Within the Collective Impact community, you'll find the archive of past webinar sessions, blog entries from past presenters, forums for discussion, and a collection of articles that focus on collective impact. And so then that brings us to the end of today's session. Thank all of you for all that you do to improve the lives of women, children, and families. And goodbye for now, and I look forward to having you all for our next Collective Impact webinar session.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.